If only you could find the key to someone's heart, what would you find when you unlocked it? What would be there? And what does it mean to have the key to someone's heart? Did Werther have the key to Lotte's heart? Did Wilhelm have the key to Marianne's heart? And what about Edward? Did he have the key to Ottilia's heart? Did these men unlock their lovers' hearts? What would be there? This question is a guiding question for Goethe. Can you ever look inside another person's heart? And if you can, what might you find there? My name's John Noyes, and I'm here to guide you through the reading of all of Goethe's novels. And today we will look at a key that unlocks a mystery in Wilhelm Meister's Journeyman years. Goethe's men in love don't seem to do a very good job of looking inside of the hearts of the women they're in love with. And if they do ever find a key, it's not entirely clear whether they succeed in opening a heart to loving inspection. If we look at Werther and Lotte, it seems that this is unlikely. And if we look at the suffering caused by characters like the young Werther to Marianne, or Edward to Ottilia, and again Werther and Lotte, then it seems that they don't manage to look very hard into the hearts of their beloveds. And why not? We learn this when we read a description of Edward. Early on in the novel we learn that Edward was not used to denying himself what he wanted. Spoiled from early childhood, he had been the only child of rich parents. So if part of a man's education is to teach him to overcome this spoiled disposition, or to overcome a bad education, or to learn to control the impulses that drive them to only want to seize what they want and not to look into another person's heart, if all of this is what education is about, then the key to a person's heart is something which might lie at the end of a successful education. We know, though, from Goethe's writing that not only is he reluctant to allow his men in love to gain access to the hearts of their beloved, he's also very reluctant to allow us readers to gain too deep an insight into the workings of his characters' minds. He tantalizingly makes his constant ironic references to what they are and are not thinking, what they are and are not learning, what they are and are not experiencing. But he also does a very good job of keeping us at a certain distance. So the question arises when we read Goethe in terms of the key to the heart of his characters. The question arises, does he really want to open up the hearts of his protagonists and also all of the other characters to inspection? Or maybe it's not that he doesn't want to. Maybe there's something about the knowledge of another individual where he realizes we have to stop short of believing that we can gain complete access. By the time we meet Wilhelm in the Journeyman years, Goethe has already given him a partner and has allowed him to complete his apprenticeship, and has also taught him something about renunciation. And it's not by chance that the Renunciants is the subtitle he gives to this novel. He's already explored the idea of renunciation in the previous novel, in Elective Affinities, and you'll recall that Elective Affinities was going to be one of the novellas in the Journeyman years, and I suspect that the function it was going to have there was to give an example, or to allow us to think of the meaning of renunciation. We learn about Edward's complete inability to renounce, And we learn what happens when Ottilia tries to explore the meaning of renunciation for her. Entsagen is almost like speaking yourself free of nature, speaking herself free of the pull of nature that wants her to forget about all social convention, all social mores and morals, and simply be together with Edward. So being spoken free, if I can use that expression for Entsagen or renunciation, being spoken free of nature is like what Wilhelm was told by the Abbé when he received his letter of apprenticeship. So as a renunciant, Wilhelm has moved on to a new and important stage of social education or social Bildung or gesellige Bildung, a new epoch, a new phase of social Bildung, just exactly like the short sketch that Goethe wrote in 1831, which he called Epochen geselliger Bildung, phases in social self-formation or social education. And as we follow Wilhelm through the Journeyman years, we see that a lot of his self-formation and his social relationships have to do with his ability to renounce, his ability to speak himself free of nature. And I'm going to be talking about an interesting example of that a little bit later on. But if Wilhelm is now on the path to some kind of renunciation, it's not entirely clear what kind of renunciation it is, but if he is on this path, then what about Felix? Because remember, this is where the key link between the apprenticeship and the journeyman years lies, and that is that Wilhelm is now in charge of Felix's education, his Bildung. So is this now Felix's apprenticeship? Is this Felix Meister's apprenticeship? And if it is, what will he do with some of the major problems that Wilhelm seems to have overcome? Not necessarily because of his own power or his own determination or his own cleverness, but something has been given to him in his life that allowed him to move beyond some of his major defects. Now, what about Felix? If Felix is given the key to another person's heart, or if Felix goes in search of the key to another person's heart, what will he do with it? Goethe explores this question using a very clever device which runs right through the entire novel and which in a way mirrors the structure of the novel. And that is the story, the Enigma of the Casket. Felix finds the casket very early on in the book. Remember that he and his father are exploring some caverns, or at least Felix is exploring some caverns. He's been told not to go there, but he does anyway, because he could get lost. And he comes back with a mysterious casket in Book 1, Chapter 4. We read there that Felix emerges from one of the caves, and he asks his father suspiciously, "Are you alone?" And then when Wilhelm assures him that he is alone, then he goes back into the cave and he emerges carrying a small casket, no larger than a small octavo volume, old and splendid in appearance. Now, Mark Redfield has written rather nicely in his 1996 article on Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahre. He's written rather nicely about the way Goethe equates this casket, this enigmatic casket, with a book, and perhaps even with the book that we hold when we hold Wilhelm Meister's Journeyman years. I think this is important, and I'm going to come back to it, but I'm more interested right now in something else that happens towards the end of the novel, once the key has been found. Now, in Book 1, Chapter 12, Wilhelm leaves this casket with an old collector of antiquities in a castle, which they stumble into in rather dubious ways. and he leaves it there for safekeeping. This is where the comment is made, I mentioned this last time, that it might be possible to open it by force, but if fate is smiling on Wilhelm, then the key will be found. And that is indeed what happens. But we have to wait until book 3, in chapter 2, when Hersilia writes to Wilhelm and says she's found the key. And in fact, we get a picture of the key. In chapter 7 of book 3, she writes again to Wilhelm, and she says that she now has both key and casket because the old collector has died and she's gotten the casket. She has the key and the casket. Time to open them, time to solve the mystery of what's inside. So can Wilhelm and Felix please come and join her, and they'll open the casket. Wilhelm can't, but Felix is going to. But again, we have to wait until the penultimate chapter of the book before the casket gets opened. So the entire novel has been pushing onwards towards this moment where an enigma is going to be resolved. But let's watch what happens. It's the penultimate chapter. The book is about to close. Felix has joined Hersilia. Wilhelm doesn't. And Hersilia is writing to Wilhelm and telling him what happened. And this is what we read. Hersilia begins her letter saying that she wanted to uncover her thoughts to Wilhelm, to open up her heart to him, who knows. But she was interrupted by a horse and the door flying open, and in strides Felix in youthful radiance like a young idol. He's coming in like a storm and stressed hero, all passion and emotion, and this is how he's going to continue in this chapter. So they start talking about the casket. Hersilia writes, "He knows that I have it and demands to see it. I give in. It was impossible to refuse. He looks at it, tells me in detail how he discovered it. I lose my head and betray that I am in possession of the key." And she shows him the key and he grabs it from her. And then he jumps mischievously to the other side of the table. But listen to what he says now. He says, "I have no benefit from the casket or the key," he exclaimed. "It is your heart I would wish to open, so that it should reveal itself to me. Come to meet me, press me to itself, allow me to press it to my breast." So if Wilhelm's task in this novel was to educate Felix so that he would turn out slightly differently from the young Wilhelm or from Werther or Edward, he doesn't seem to have been terribly successful. Because look what happens next. "I was more bewildered than one can and should be. He takes advantage of my confusion, leaves the casket where it is, comes after me, and takes me in his arms. I struggled in vain. His eyes drew closer to mine, and it is beautiful to see one's image in the loving eyes of another. I saw this for the first time as he passionately pressed his mouth against mine. I must admit that I returned his kisses, for it is beautiful to make someone happy. I tore loose. The gulf between us seemed to me only too distinct. Instead of composing myself, I went too far. I pushed him away angrily. My confusion gave me courage and sense. I threatened, I scolded him, ordered him never again to appear before me. He took me at my word. 'Good,' he said. 'I shall ride into the world until I perish.' He threw himself onto his horse and galloped off." By the time we get to the end of the book, then Goethe has told us that the enigma being presented to the reader here is not only the enigma which is encapsulated in the book, but it's also the enigma of another person's heart for a passionate and impulsive, storm and stress young man. But look what happens now. "He was infinitely handsome and lovable," Hersilia writes, "and as I tried to approach him, he kept pushing the casket before him along the table. Already the key was in. He threatened to turn it, and really did turn it. The little key broke off, the outer half fell on the table." He's too impulsive in his pursuit of Enigma, and the key breaks. Along comes a goldsmith. An elderly goldsmith and a jewel merchant comes in, and she brings out the casket. He examines the broken key and points out what we'd previously overlooked, that the break is not rough but smooth. On contact, the two ends lock onto each other, and he draws the key out whole. They are magnetically joined and hold each other, but unlock only for the initiate. The man steps back some distance, the casket springs open, but he quickly snaps it shut again. Such secrets are better left untouched, he said. And this is the closest we're going to get to the enigma, the guiding central enigma of this novel. So if the casket is a symbol of the novel itself, as Redfield says, then this is what Goethe does with the novel's enigma. We cannot see it. And if the casket is a symbol of Herselia's heart, then it's the same thing. What are we to make of this? We're given some indication by the way Goethe includes 3 other caskets in this novel, and I'd like now to briefly turn to those. First of all, there's the casket in the novella The Man of 50 Years. Now, this novella is tied to the overall story of the novel, and it's tied to the central enigma that we just examined by the character of Hersilia, who falls in love with a man who is 50 years old, much older than her, and happens to be her uncle, but that doesn't seem to be too much of a problem, although when he first finds out, he says this is an unnatural bond. We're never told exactly what is unnatural about it, but it seems to be less the fact that this is a niece and her uncle than the fact that he's so much older than her. There is, however, a remedy for this, and that is he meets an old actor friend of his who manages to stay very young looking. He's referred to as an aged youth. And what's his secret? He has a casket. He has a little box, and in his box he has all kinds of cosmetics, which, if used properly, will keep an elderly man looking young. And of course, Flavio simply cannot resist. So in order to overcome nature, and in order to come to terms with this unnatural situation, he opens a casket. And what he hopes from this casket, we read on page 217, and that is to bring his head and face into harmony with his heart. But the contents of this casket don't remain an enigma to us. We learn that the contents of this casket are there in order to contrive against the forces of nature. And we know Goethe well enough by now to know that this is in vain. We come across another casket in another one of the novellas in chapter 6 of book 3, and that is the story of the new Melusine. We see a casket there which is also a secret chamber for a beloved of an impulsive man, and it conceals a hidden world, a natural, or better said, a supernatural world to which his love wants to give him access. And we read about the various different processes by which he does indeed gain access to it. But what he discovers is that when he unlocks the heart of his beloved and enters her supernatural realm, where she is in fact a tiny princess, he is being used, if I can put it like that, put in a position where his genetic material is being used to rejuvenate a deteriorating race. And when he joins her, when he himself by magic means shrinks and becomes tiny and joins her in her casket, he joins her tiny magic world, her tiny supernatural world, he discovers he cannot live there. And why can't he live? Very, very interesting when we read these lines. I'm just going to read them. This is on page 357. We read, "Everything about me was completely suited to my present shape and needs. The bottles and glasses were correctly scaled for a small drinker, indeed, if you will, somewhat better than among us. The delicate bites of food tasted wonderful to my small palate. A kiss from my wife's little mouth was absolutely delicious, and I would not deny that novelty made all these conditions highly agreeable. But for all this, I had unfortunately not forgotten my previous state. I still retained some sense of my former size, which made me restless and unhappy. For the first time I comprehended what philosophers mean when they speak of those ideals which supposedly cause mankind such mental torment. I had an ideal of myself, and sometimes appeared to myself in dreams as a giant. In short, a wife, the ring, my dwarfish stature, and so many other constraints made me thoroughly unhappy, so that I began to plan in earnest for my liberation." So in this case, if a lover is unable to enter the world of his beloved, is unable to live in the world of his beloved's heart, if the casket is the symbol of the princess's heart, if the lover is unable to dwell there, it's because the being he has to be in order to do that does not correspond to his ideal self. So this could very well be a comment on Bildung, because what after all is Bildung except learning to approximate your ideal self? And it's interesting that this episode comes immediately before the letter where Hersilia writes to Wilhelm and tells him now not only does she have the key, but she also has the casket. So this sets up the situation where the casket can be opened, the enigma can be resolved, and the heart of the beloved can be entered. Except now we have the lingering doubt, is this perhaps running counter to the natural idea of self-formation? Now, if the three caskets that we've seen so far carry a warning with them, then there is also another kind of a casket we're going to encounter in the novel. So we've had a warning that maybe you cannot dig too deep into Enigma because, as the goldsmith says, it can be dangerous what you find. There's the warning that the search for the key to another person's heart might lead to a world which you cannot inhabit, or it might lead to an unnatural world. But then there's also the casket that Wilhelm has been carrying with him throughout the entire novel, which embodies his core calling, his Bildung, his calling to be a surgeon, which was already prepared in the apprenticeship. In fact, he writes to Natalia in Book 2, Chapter 11, and explains that this casket that he's been carrying with him is now the key to his fulfillment. He tells her on page 292, "You surely remember the set of instruments your capable surgeon produced when I lay wounded in the woods, and you came to my aid. At that time it glistened so before my eyes and made such a deep impression that I was utterly enchanted when years later I encountered it again in the hands of a younger man. The latter placed no particular value on it. All the instruments had been improved in recent times and made more functional. I acquired it all the more easily because that helped him to procure a new one. From then on, I carried it with me always, not for use to be sure, but rather as a comforting memento." And then he goes on to say that it would surely be better if he would learn how to use them. And the lead into this story is another narrative of an experience that he had as a child. And it's an experience of intense friendship, I think we can say homoerotic friendship, leading to death. So it's an intense experience of friendship, love, passion, and death. Let's explore that for a moment. On page 286, he writes the following to Natalie, describing this early friendship. His friend is an excellent swimmer and is going to initiate him into the art and the pleasure of swimming. And we read, "A very strange mood had come over me. Grasshoppers danced around me, ants scurried about, colorful beetles hung in the branches, and gold-glittering dragonflies, for so he had called them, hovered and fluttered phantom-like at my feet, just as the boy, pulling a large crab from a tangle of roots, held it up gaily for me to see, then skilfully concealed it again in its old place, ready for the catch. It was so hot and sultry all around that one longed to be out of the sun and in the shade, then out of the cool of the shade and down into the cooler water. So it was easy for him to lure me down. He did not have to repeat his invitation often, for I found it irresistible, and felt, despite some fear of my parents, as well as wariness toward the unknown element, extraordinary excitement. But once I undressed on the sand, I cautiously ventured into the water, though no farther than the gently sloping bottom permitted. He let me linger there, moved away in the buoyant element, then swam back, and as he climbed out and stood up to dry off in the light of the sun, I thought my eyes were dazzled by a triple sun. So beautiful was the human form, of which I had never had any notion. He seemed to look at me with the same attention. Quickly dressed, we still faced each other without veils. Our hearts were drawn to one another, and with fiery kisses we swore eternal friendship. Now this intimate communion with another person's heart is shattered in death, as if it's perhaps not possible. Nevertheless, it provides the impulse for Wilhelm to acquire the casket in direct connection with meeting Natalia, and this is the casket which at the end of the novel he will use to save Felix's life, to save Felix also from drowning, from the fate that met his friend back then. And listen to the way this is described. These are the closing words of the novel. Wilhelm immediately reached for his lancet to open a vein in his arm. A rich stream of blood sprang forth, and mingling with the winding, rippling waves, followed the course of the swirling stream. Life returned. The loving surgeon barely had time to fasten the bandage, before the young man was already bravely getting to his feet, looking keenly at Wilhelm and crying, "If I am to live, let it be with you." So this bond between father and son has been sealed, and at the very end of this chapter we read that the active men, rejoicing in anticipation of a happy outcome to a good action and the prospect of a generous reward, had already almost dried the youth's clothing on the hot sand, so that when he awoke he could at once be restored to the condition most fitting for society. The clothing of Felix here, to restore him to a condition fitting for society, is like the clothing on the youth with whom Wilhelm had fallen in love way back then. So Goethe has shown us a casket which is the enigma of the story which we are reading, an enigma which probably we can never gaze on, and he's also shown us the casket which contains the secrets of a beloved's heart, which are probably too dangerous to look upon. He's shown us unnatural caskets which want to go against aging processes. He's shown us a world inside of a casket which cannot be occupied by the lover. But he's also shown us a casket which contains the instruments which will allow the impulses for self-development to be realized in a beneficial way. And it's our task as readers to decide whether we want to open this casket which we hold in our hands, and since we cannot gaze inside, what we want to imagine is there.